Hi, it's Dre Griggs with Obsidian Wisdom. Today we discuss strategies for building a dividend portfolio. The goal of today's video is to help you build a solid foundation for sustainable investing. The 5 questions that we'll answer today are: which companies pay the best dividends? What's the difference between high yield and dividend growth stocks? How do I build a portfolio for passive income? What is a good dividend yield? And what are the risks of dividend investing? Our first question is, which companies pay the best dividend? As we mentioned in the first video, we know that there are sectors where we can invest our money, where we can search for dividends, and we know that they're more likely to pay dividends even in a down economy. These sectors normally include healthcare, consumer staples, which just means it's something that people have to buy. So when I say consumer staples, you have to buy toilet paper, you have to buy water and food. There are things that you basically are going to spend your last dollar on. And you would say, I'm not going to buy that right now because we're in an economic downturn, we're in a recession, and that would be consumer discretionary. So that could be taking a cruise. You're less likely to take a cruise in a recession, but you're probably still going to buy food and water and toilet paper. So those are consumer staples. It's a staple in your household. So consumer staples, healthcare, utilities, and financials are all companies that will generally pay out consistent dividends. And the reason you can sort of tell is I just talked about what a consumer staple is versus consumer discretionary. Each of these industries are pretty much required in every economic climate. You're going to need credit to buy a house or a car or to get a loan. You're going to need toilet paper. So you still have the consumer staples. You still need your utilities and energy, and you still need your healthcare. So when you look at these sectors, we know already from a just human experience perspective, these are all things that I have to spend my money on. I don't want to go to the doctor, but if I need to go, I'm going to go. I don't want to spend my money on gas and different things, but if I got to get from point A to point B, I'm going to spend my money on these things. And so when you're looking at building a sustainable investment strategy, if you have your dividends in these sectors, it's more likely that you'll keep getting these dividends. And what I'll do is I'll share a list with you where I'll give you one stable stock in every sector, because there are dividend stocks in every sector. We're simply saying, if we're trying to make it easy for ourselves, I'm not like Dre, where I like looking at this information all day. Those are normally going to be a great place to start to find the diamonds. So for example, Procter & Gamble is considered a leading consumer staple. They've paid dividends for the past 130 years, which makes them a dividend king, if you remember our last video. And they've increased their payouts for almost 70 consistent years. 70 years of consistent increases in the dividends that they paid out, which makes this a pretty reliable dividend stock to have as a part of your overall portfolio. When you're looking at the dividend yield, and remember, the dividend yield is simply telling you what your return on investment is. So we take the dividend and we divide it by the price of the stock. It's important to know, and I do go over that much more in the first video, a dividend yield is one metric. It's very hard to look at one metric and make a decision on any company, any stock, because it doesn't tell me the whole picture. For example, I know that a company with $1 dividend and the stock price is $20, that would be 1 divided by 20, which is a 5% dividend yield. But without knowing anything else about the company, did the price actually go down recently because something bad was happening at the company? Because that would technically increase the dividend yield. Or at the same time, did the price go up in the company because they're doing phenomenal, they're breaking all the records, which means that the dividend yield technically decreased because the price went up a lot more. Where the price of the stock went from $20 to $30, my dividend yield went from 5% to 3.3%. And technically the company is doing better. I say all that to say that this is just one metric. And so when we look at the dividend yield, yes, that tells us something about the company, but it doesn't tell us everything about the company. And so when you look at the list, I have consumer staples. So we have Procter & Gamble. We know that their dividend yield is about 2.5%, and then they have a payout ratio of 60%. And if you don't remember, your payout ratio is how much of my earnings do I give out in a dividend. And we know that being around that 50%, we know that that's a good payout ratio and it's relatively sustainable. Once we get over 75%, we start getting a little uncomfortable, because if you're giving away 75% of your earnings, I have a lot of questions about the way you're running your company. And there are companies out there that give over 100% of their earnings out in a dividend. And I have even more questions for that company and how long they think they're going to be in business going forward. But Procter & Gamble, we see that they have a dividend yield of 2.5%, and they have a payout ratio roughly about 60%. In the technology sector, Microsoft is a stable blue chip company that pays a dividend. and their dividend yield is about 1% and their payout ratio is about 30%. Our third sector, we're going to look at healthcare. We have Johnson & Johnson. We have about 3% dividend yield with a 55% payout ratio. Johnson & Johnson is considered a dividend king because they have been paying out dividends for more than 50 years consistently. They're actually closer to 60 years. And when you talk about the healthcare sector, that's actually normally a very stable sector to be in because, as we mentioned, even if you're in a recession, you got to go to the doctor. So we find that that's normally a great strategy as far as diversifying your portfolio to make sure that you have something that performs very well in a recession and you have something that performs very well in times of high economic growth. Our next sector is financials, and we have JP Morgan Chase. They have a dividend yield of about 3%, payout ratio roughly 35%. JP Morgan is a household name. We all know that bank. It's a very stable, consistent bank that's been around for a very long time. They have a very solid dividend strategy, and so we're very comfortable that they'll be able to pay that dividend throughout our entire retirement. When you're looking at the energy sector, we use ExxonMobil, has about a 3.5% dividend yield, a 45% payout ratio. And despite the volatility of the energy sector, ExxonMobil has been paying its dividend for decades consistently. And so we know they have a strategy that has withstood the test of time, and they even pay their dividends when the oil market was crashing. And so we know that this is going to be normally a very consistent and stable dividend to have in our portfolio. In utilities, we have NextEra Energy. They have a dividend yield of about 2.5%, a payout ratio roughly about 60%, and they're a leader in renewable energy, which means that we not only have the stable dividend, but we also have opportunities for the upside, just the appreciation of the stock, because if clean energy becomes all the rage and everyone is out there looking for clean energy, well, NextEra is going to benefit a lot from that. So we have a consistent dividend, but we also gave ourselves the opportunity that as we make shifts toward clean energy, then you have the opportunity to grow with that company. Next, we have real estate and realty income. They have a dividend yield of about 5%, payout ratio of about 80%, which is kind of getting up there, but that's not uncommon for REITs because for them to receive a lot of their tax advantages, by law, they have to give out the majority of their profits. So that's nothing that we wouldn't expect. That is not surprising or concerning in the least. Now, this particular REIT pays out monthly. So if you're someone that was looking for a monthly income stream, this would be one of those dividends for you to take a look at. And they have been paying out their dividend consistently for the past 25 years, which makes this one a dividend aristocrat. In consumer discretionary, we have Home Depot. They have about a 2.3% dividend yield, about a 45% payout ratio. And the cool thing about Home Depot is they have consistent, steady dividend growth, but also because they're in the housing industry, this one is one that normally makes sense during times of high economic growth, where everybody's buying a house, everybody's flipping the houses, and houses are appreciating. If your house is appreciating, then you're probably investing in your house, maybe a new kitchen or remodeling. If houses are being sold, then I'm updating some of the appliances. So you can see why this particular sector would be great for us during times of high economic growth. Next, we have industrials, so 3M, which most people know. They have a dividend yield of 5%, payout ratio about 60%, and this is a dividend king. So they've been paying their dividends out for over 50 years, closer to 60 years as well. So this one's normally going to be a consistent dividend that a lot of people will have in their portfolio as well. And the 10th and final sector is going to be communication services. For that one, we chose Verizon, who has some of the highest dividend payout ratios in the entire industry. They have a dividend yield of 7%, but it is a sustainable dividend yield as their payout ratio is only 50%. So when you're looking for the companies that pay the best dividend, you could simply follow the strategy of saying, I'm only going to choose companies that have paid a dividend for at least 10 years, for at least 25 years, because when it comes to my retirement, I want to make sure that I receive my dividend every single year of my retirement, not a company that might get rid of their dividend halfway through my retirement or have to reevaluate my withdrawal strategy. And if that were the case, you can fill your portfolio with companies like Procter & Gamble, Johnson & Johnson, and Coca-Cola, and you'd be just fine. Question number 2 is, what is the difference between high yield and dividend growth stocks? When you think about high yield stocks, remember when we talked about the dividend yield, that is simply what the dividend dollar amount is divided by the price of that particular stock. When you look at that, when we're saying high yield, we're basically saying the yield is higher, that percentage is higher. That is going to provide you immediate short-term income, but it might be at the expense of future growth. And that's usually what's going to happen. You're either going to choose high yield or dividend growth. Dividend growth is the opposite. My yield might not be that much as far as a percentage of the overall stock price, but I believe this stock is going to continue growing, is going to continue appreciating. AT&T would be an example of a high yield company. So AT&T is a little bit older. We don't expect to see a lot of growth happening. And the growth of the stock has been pretty consistent, but it's on the lower end. There is not a lot more going on. AT&T is who AT&T is. but it is a high yield dividend. So their dividend yield is about 7%. So I'm getting all of the money up front. I'm not investing in this stock for future growth. AT&T already has a large market share. They're well known. They saturated most markets. There's not a lot more that they could do. They're a household name across most of America. But because I'm getting high dividend yield, I have that immediate benefit. The opposite example of this, a dividend growth stock, would be Microsoft. Microsoft is in the tech sector, and we know just not too long ago, we called them the Magnificent Seven. And these were the 7 companies that most people believe would be leading the AI revolution. So these companies have been growing as far as their stock value, but Microsoft's dividend is roughly at 1%. So the dividend yield is not very high, but it is a dividend growth stock, so I'm buying it for a different reason. Now, you will decide what makes the most sense for you. Do you need immediate income? Okay, then that means we should focus more on yield and less on growth. Do you have time to let your portfolio grow? Then we would focus on the growth because that would give you a larger portfolio and not as much on the yield, even though we appreciate the income stream, but that's not the main focus. So if you wanted to and you didn't have a strong pull either way, you can focus on dividend yield for 50% of your portfolio. You can focus on dividend growth for 50% of your portfolio. So on the dividend yield side, you can focus on stocks like Verizon, which we already mentioned has some of the highest dividend yields inside of the communications sector as a whole at 7%. And then you can focus on Apple when it comes to the dividend growth side, because Apple isn't giving as high of a dividend yield, but the stock is still growing. It's $1 trillion company and they keep innovating and they keep growing. So my portfolio is going to grow with Apple. My income in the immediate short term is going to continue increasing with my Verizon stock. Question number 3 is, how do I build a portfolio for passive income? When it comes to building passive income, when I think passive income, I think long-term. And so when it comes to you building something long-term, we normally have to diversify in a variety of sectors. We've already gone over at least one dividend stock in a variety of sectors. We also talked about whether we're focusing on dividend growth or focusing on dividend yield. Just based off that information alone, I could build a variety of asset allocations that will get me the percentage that I need as far as the growth and the dollar amount I need as monthly income. I'll give you one example where you can allocate 40% of your stock towards dividend aristocrats for stability. As we mentioned, it means that this company has been giving a dividend for at least 25 years, less than 50, because once you get over 50, you're a dividend king. But we know a dividend aristocrat has been at least 25 years. That is a very stable dividend that could be a part of our portfolio. And then I can allocate 30% of my portfolio towards growth. So whether I do that internationally for global exposure or whether I focus on companies in the US like the S&P 500, I'm going to have 30% of this portfolio that's focused on growth. And then I'll have the last 30% towards real estate investment trust or REITs for higher yields. So I have my growth covered, I have my higher yields covered, and I also have my stability where, hey, I'm trying to get something stable and consistent together for retirement, and I don't have a lot of time to be worried about losing money. This portfolio allows me the balance of nearing retirement where I don't want to lose all of my money or a high percentage of my money. I have 40% of it stable. These companies probably aren't going anywhere, and if they do, we're in a lot of trouble just in general if you look at these stable companies. But I also gave myself 30% of my portfolio still focused on growth because I'm not trying to phone it in. I still want to have my income streams, but I also want to make sure my portfolio is growing and keeping up with inflation. And I have the last 30% allocated towards REITs because, as we just discussed, there are literally tax incentives where if they want to be able to write off the majority of their taxes, they have to pass through most of that income to the shareholders, and you would be a shareholder. So they pass through, I think, 80–90% of the income to the shareholders. So that's why REITs are always high yield, where they give high dividend yields. Would not be crazy to find one at 5, 10, even 12%. That leads us very nicely into question number 4, which is, what is a good dividend yield? So we're looking at average to be somewhere from 2 to 6%. I mentioned in the first video of this series that having a dividend yield of 4% or higher is normally going to be a good place to be. If the bare minimum is 2%, in a lot of cases, what's considered great is 6%. That's why we get the 4% as far as just that's normally pretty good. And then naturally, you also want to look at the payout ratio because it just gives context to what the dividend yield is. Remember, the dividend yield is how much the dividend is compared to the stock price. And the payout ratio is how much the dividend is compared to the earnings. So when we look at the payout ratio, we normally want it to be below 75%. So we want to have a dividend yield of about 4%, want to have a payout ratio below 75%. And normally if we have those are 2 great metrics as far as just looking at a company. Naturally, we want to look further. We want to look at the financials, see how the company is doing, how many years they've been paying dividend, how many years of growth have they had in the past 10 years. All of these factors come into play when we decide whether or not we should buy a stock. But when you're looking at a dividend stock, so we've already said this is a good company. From a dividend perspective, if it's a 4% yield and a lower than 75% payout ratio, we normally say that is a stable yield that you can expect to receive throughout the life of your retirement. An example of a safe yield would be Pepsi Cola. Pepsi Cola has a yield at about 3%. And it has a payout ratio below 75%. So that is considered a safe yield and one that we could look at adding into our portfolio. On the other end, if there was a company that we were uncomfortable with, and I don't want to call anybody out, but basically if you looked at the dividend yield and the yield was maybe 12%, so you're like, hey, this is a great yield. But then you looked at the payout ratio and you found out it was 110%. And you're like, well, wait a minute. You're telling me that you're giving away more than what you earn each year in a dividend? I don't see how that's going to last for the life of my retirement. Then I would say that's a risky dividend, and I'm probably not going to invest in that one for my retirement portfolio. Our fifth and final question is, what are the risks of dividend investing? So some of these risks just have to do with investing in stocks. Some of them are unique to dividends. If your dividend portfolio is focused on stability, where we have a lot of high yields, but they're very stable companies, your portfolio is going to grow much slower than if you focused on growth. So you have this decision to make whether you want to focus on income, but you might be a little bit too safe as far as your allocation of how much you need it to grow. But then if you focus on growth, you might not be able to put that many great dividend stocks in your portfolio. That there is a balance, and that's why portfolio allocation is so important, because you want to make sure your portfolio is growing, because your dividend is going to be a percentage of what your overall portfolio is. Our second risk of dividend investing is dividend cuts. So a lot of the times the company is paying its dividends from its profits. So if our profits go down, we might cut our dividends for that year or maybe the next few years, or we may cut them all together. General Electric, GE, was an example of that. They had low profits in 2018 and they cut their dividend that year. So if you were retired and you had GE, or you had a large percentage of GE, because they have a history, they've been paying dividends for a very long time. And then as the economy changed, they weren't generating the profits that they used to. And so they had to cut their dividend. Dividend cuts can feel unpredictable and unexpected, but it is something that we do need to be mindful of and thinking about when we're putting our portfolio together. Number three is economic downturns. When we're dealing with a recession, that impacts all of our portfolios, but your dividend is based off of these companies' profits. So it's like you get hit twice. You have the chance of them not giving out dividend cut, but then you also have the decrease in the overall portfolio, where you have a smaller portfolio and a smaller dividend payment, which is why normally we have to be mindful of the sectors that we're in. There are some sectors, as we mentioned earlier, that perform well in every economic climate, and there's other sectors that perform well only in times of economic growth, which leads us very nicely into the next risk of dividend investing. Is you don't want to be over-concentrated in any one sector. If you're over-concentrated in an economic growth sector like consumer discretionary spending, well, that's what we're doing when we have all the money in the world. We're buying jewelry, we're taking trips, we're going on vacation, all these different things. We're splurging. Well, as soon as the recession comes, that's the sector that gets hit the hardest. That's the first thing that people cut out of their budget when they have to make hard decisions. Just like if you were to run a company, we normally know that the first sector that they cut is research and development or HR. That is just what most companies do, and the same thing is true when it comes to us running our own household. Normally, if there is a recession, one of the first things that we're going to cut is our discretionary spending. If that is where a lot of your dividend income is coming from, then when a recession comes, then you're over-concentrated and you're going to feel it a lot worse. On the other hand, if you're diversified in a variety of sectors where you have some healthcare, you have some consumer discretionary, but you also have consumer staples, well, now you know that your dividend strategy is looking good in a variety of economic climates, and you're not as concerned about dealing with a recession because you built yourself a future-proof portfolio allocation. Ultimately, when it comes to dealing with the risk of dividend investing, you're basically going to do what you do with all your investments. You got to review them periodically. You got to see what your allocations are. You got to make sure that you're not overly concentrated, where a certain allocation was performing really well and another one wasn't. So now your portfolio is out of whack. And then there's an economic shift, and all of a sudden you lose a lot of those gains because you didn't rebalance your portfolio. You got to keep an eye on the company and the sector as a whole. Did a new administration come in that's favorable to that industry, or did a new administration come in that's not favorable to that industry? Should you adjust your allocations one way or the other? You normally just want to be mindful. You want to give yourself the flexibility because you periodically review it. I'm not telling you to day trade. I'm not telling you to look at it every day and follow the tickers at the bottom of the TV. But I am saying that you should probably look at it once a month, once a quarter, once a year. But you do want to take a look at your portfolio, see how the allocation is adjusted, and just see how you're performing as a whole. Whether the assumptions that you made when you put that portfolio together, are they still true? And if they're not, how would you adjust and compensate in today's current economic environment? As you can see, building a dividend portfolio requires strategic planning, diversification, and a keen eye for the financials of a company. By balancing immediate income with long-term growth, you can build a sustainable stream of passive income to last your entire retirement. As always, I'm thankful for our time together. I don't take it for granted. Thank you again. If you're enjoying this second video in our dividend investment strategy series, go ahead and like and subscribe so you can continue receiving valuable insights on how to create your own wealthy retirement system. Until next time, stay safe and enjoy life.